Because or despite our status as secluded or quarantined, we are living quite a life here at Ecumen Seasons at Apple Valley. We have referred to us as possibly being victims of too much information and at the same time possibly suffering from boredom. Probably both are true. Suggestions have been advanced that we need to exercise our brains as well as our bodies, and we will give some specific examples of that, how that can be done in some future Stew Talks. Several medical research studies have proposed the importance of awakening our brain cells, both of strictly remembering facts and events and applying them to our daily lives. For most of us, we have been through our life as children, as parents, siblings, grandparents, and great-grandparents, and beyond. One or more of our current residents are part of the 5 living generations. Recognizing that we are sequestered and quarantined, we're going to rely on our brains today. This should be fun. Some can compare part of our activities to watching some of the quiz programs we watch nearly every day. Often we can be thrilled that we could have won thousands of dollars by answering these questions. One or more of the remedies of boredom is thinking of new information and new topics. I'm going to mention some historical dates, names, and events which maybe are not common, but are not obscure or unimportant, and see if we can apply them to what we already know or remember, and consider them itself as new topics. I know that there are differences between strictly remembering something and to challenging our brains, but both are important. Our body parts usually work together quite well, but briefly think of ourselves today as just our brains. I have read that brains are about the size of a cantaloupe, and yet a single word or date can trigger an hour or more of memories of facts and discussion. If someone insults you and claims that your brain is like a melon, don't get insulted. Just say, "Thank you, you are correct." If I say December 7th, 1941, November 22nd, 1963, or 9/11, the brain cells of nearly all of us will become excited and stimulated, and ideas will flow out of us like a river. These are too easy, even for our quiz programs. All of the following situations were probably mentioned in your elementary, middle, or high school classes, or American history or American studies. Some memories or understandings will come from our brains vaguely, but then we will say to ourselves, "Oh yeah, I remember that." It would be even more fun if we were in a two-way discussion group and could respond verbally, but we are not. I'm going to list several items, and you can imagine you are either at school or interested in current events in your living rooms, ready to win thousands of dollars. Remember that these questions and answers are real, but are not to test anyone's intelligence, but to show how our brains work by awakening some brain cells that may not have been active in a few years. Number one, the mystery of the lost colony. How does that make you think about things? This lost colony completely disappeared in what later became part of the United States of America. Another name connected with the lost colony is the name Virginia Dare, D-A-R-E. That might be clicking into your memories right now. Most of us like mystery stories, and here is a real puzzle. The second one, and then I will later explain each of these. 2019 was the 20th anniversary of a ship bearing a specific cargo landing in what later became part of the United States of America. Number 3, a romance. We all love romance stories. A romance among two Mayflower passengers which resulted in a marriage after they landed, and they later had 10 children. Number 4, at least one Mayflower passenger was not there due to religious persecution, but was hired shortly before the ship left because and he was hired just before they left because he was a cooper. The question is, for you, what was a cooper and why was that important? Who was another one? Who was Squanto and why was he important? Partly think of the first Thanksgiving and how the folks from the Mayflower existed and survived. Number 9, think of the first officially, legally recorded biracial marriage in what later became the United States of America. Here's a hint. It was not between a Caucasian and an African American. 7, the wife had one child who later had many descendants. The wife's history was greatly exaggerated by Walt Disney. The wife's name, though completely honorable, became a negative taunt and slur during the 1916 presidential election, and this continues into the present year. And last, the improbable same death dates of two American patriots, both former presidents of the United States who were at times close allies and other times political opponents. They died on the same date. Now let's review some of these historical statements and see what brain cells may have been quickened. Number 1. Here is some more information on the lost colony of Roanoke that you probably expected, but it is still all interesting And more, if you think about that and waking up your brain cells and still possibly being overloaded with accounts of too much information about our current virus, or by just being bored. Note that work continues to solve this mystery. The origin of one of America's oldest unsolved mystery can be traced to August 1567, when a group of about 115 English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Later that year, it was decided that John White, governor of the new colony, would sail back to England in order to gather a fresh load of supplies. But as he arrived in England, a naval battle was broken out between England and Spain, and Queen Elizabeth I called on every available ship to confront the mighty Spanish Armada. In August 1590, White finally returned to Roanoke, where he had left his wife and daughter, his infant granddaughter, named Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, what became America's, and the other settlers 3 long years before. Here's the mystery. He found no trace of the colony or its inhabitants, and few clues to what might have happened apart from a single word. The word was Croatoan, carved into a wooden post. Investigations into the lost colony of Roanoke have continued over the centuries, but no one has come up with a satisfactory answer. Croatoan was the name of an island south of Roanoke that was home to a Native American tribe of the same name. Perhaps the colonists were killed or were abducted by Native Americans. The hypotheses told that one hypothesis was that they tried to build their own ship, fly back to England, and they were destroyed at sea, and that nobody survived. Another idea is that they made a bloody end at the hands of Spaniards who had marched up from Florida, and that they moved further inland and were absorbed into a friendly tribe. In 2007, efforts began to collect and analyze DNA from local families to figure out if they are related to the Roanoke settlers, local Native American lines, or both. Despite the lingering mystery, it seems there is one thing to be thankful for. The lessons learned at Roanoke may have helped the next group of English settlers who found their own colony 17 years later, just a short distance to the north. Here is some more information about the lost colony, but most of it is speculation from continuing archaeological research. When John White, appointed by Sir Walter Raleigh as governor of Roanoke Colony, returned to England for more supplies. In late 1587, he left behind, as I mentioned, his wife, his daughter, and his infant granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first child born in the New World to English parents, among other settlers. Upon White's return in 1590, he found no trace of his family or the other inhabitants of the abandoned colony. Over the centuries to come, archaeologists, historians, and explorers would delve into this mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke, all failing to find definitive answers. Based on the scant clues left, some speculated that Native Americans attacked and killed the English colonists. Croatan was the name of an island south of Roanoke, now Hatteras Island, which at the time was home to a Native American tribe of the same name. Or they might have sailed back to England on their own and became lost at sea, or became killed by hostile Spaniards who came north from their own settlements in Florida. One enduring theory was that the settlers might have been absorbed into Native American tribes, perhaps after moving further inland. The search continues. 2 independent teams found archaeological remains suggesting that at least some of the Roanoke colonists might have survived and split into 2 groups, each of which assimilated itself into different Native American communities. One team is now excavating a site near Cape Creek on Hatteras Island, while the other is based on the mainland, about 60 miles to the northwest of Roanoke site. This was the site of a major Croatian town center and trading hub. In 1998, colleges, now this is, excuse me, these dates are current dates, fairly current dates. In 1998, archaeologists from East Carolina University stumbled upon a unique find from early British America, a 10-carat gold signet ring engraved with a lion or a horse, believed to be the date of the 15th century. The ring's discovery prompted later excavations. In addition to these intriguing objects, this Cape Creek site yielded an iron bar and a large copper ingot or block, both found buried in layers of earth that appear to date from the late 1500s. Native Americans lacked such meteorological technology, so they believed to be European in origin. The evidence from some of that is that they assimilated with the North Americans but kept their goods. Here's something else. The 100th anniversary of the first slaves being brought to land which became the United States of America. In this year and last year, we celebrated or honored or noted, instead of celebrated, this landing of a ship carrying a cargo which became slaves. The first recorded African in British North America, including much of the future of the United States, were, quote, 20 and odd Negroes who came to Jamestown, Virginia via Cape Comfort in August 1619 as indentured servants. As English settlers died from harsh conditions, more and more Africans were brought to work as laborers. The 1619 project, and that's an ongoing project developed by the New York Times Magazine in 2019 with the goal of re-examining the legacy of slavery in the United States and timed to the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first Africans in Virginia. The New York Times has said that the contributions were and are deeply researched and arguments and controversies verified by a team of fact-checkers in consultation with historians. The 400th anniversary of their arrival has been commemorated in Virginia and through the year in Ghana. Number 3, explaining what I had mentioned before. The reference to a romance above the Mayflower is about, and these names will activate those brain cells, Priscilla Mullins and John Alden. There probably have been hundreds of movies about these two passengers. First, let's review a few facts about the Mayflower itself. Mayflower was an English ship that transported the first English Puritans, known today as the Pilgrims, from Plymouth, England to the New World in 1620. There were 102 passengers, and the crew estimated to be about 30, but the exact number is unknown. The ship has become a cultural icon in the history of the United States. We've all heard about the Mayflower. The Pilgrims signed the Mayflower Compact prior to leaving the ship and establishing the Plymouth Colony, a document which established a rudimentary form of democracy with each member contributing to the welfare of the community. There was a second ship named Mayflower, which made the London to Plymouth, Massachusetts voyage several times. In early September, western gales began to make the North Atlantic a dangerous place for sailing. Mayflower provisions were already quite low when departing Southampton, and they became slower still by delays of more than a month. The passengers had been aboard the ship for this entire time, and they were worn out and in no condition for a very taxing, lengthy Atlantic journey cooped up in the cramped spaces of a small ship. But Mayflower sailed from Plymouth on September 6, 1620. Aboard the Mayflower were many stores and supplies that supplied the pilgrims with the essentials needed for their journey and future lives. It is assumed that they carried tools and weapons, including cannon, shot, and gunpowder, as well as some of the live animals, including dogs, sheep, goats, and poultry. Horses and cattle came later. The ship also carried 2 boats, a longboat and a shallop, a 21-foot boat powered by oars or sails. She also carried 12 artillery pieces, as the pilgrims feared that they might need to defend themselves against enemy European forces as well as against the Indians. The passage was miserable, and one with huge waves constantly crashing against the ship's topside deck, fracturing a key structure of support timber. The passengers had already suffered agonizing delays, shortage of food, and other shortages, and they were now called upon to provide assistance to the ship's carpenter in repairing the fractured main support beam. This was repaired with, on board, the use of a metal mechanical device called a jack screw, which had been loaded on board to help in the construction of smaller homes when they arrived. It was now used to secure the beam to keep it from cracking further, which would have resulted in the Mayflower sinking. The crew of the Mayflower had some devices to assist them en route, such as a compass for navigation, as well as a log and line system to measure speed and nautical miles. Time was measured with the ancient method of an hourglass. Passengers would pass the time by reading by candlelight or by playing cards and games, such as a game called the Men's Moms. Meals on board were cooked by the firebox, which was an iron tray with sand on it, in which a fire was built. This was risky because it was kept in the part of the ship where the whole ship could have caught on fire. Passengers ate their own meals from rations that were issued daily, and meals were cooked for the passengers in groups of 3. All right, now we'll talk about some of the passengers. And these are passengers that I've mentioned before. Priscilla Alden, and Priscilla Mullins, she later became Priscilla Alden, and James Alden. She was a noted member of the Massachusetts Plymouth Colony of Pilgrims, and she was noted on the Mayflower because she was young, beautiful, and unmarried. That would certainly, the others would have noticed that. And she became the wife of fellow colonist John Alden, who lived from 1599 to 1687. They married in 1621 in Plymouth. John Alden and Priscilla Mullins were probably the third couple to be married in the Plymouth colony. John Alden was a member of the historic 1620 voyage of the Mayflower, which brought the English colonists, settlers, commonly known as pilgrims, to Plymouth colony. He was hired in Southampton, England, as the ship's cooper, responsible for maintaining the ship's barrels. A lot of the passengers were there for religious freedom, but he was there to keep the barrels from breaking apart. Priscilla and John Alden had 10 children, with a possible 11th child dying in infancy. Here's another name that will bring a little awakening of your minds. Squanto. Squanto was a Native American from a nearby tribe, the Pauxet tribe, who taught the pilgrims of the American colony how to survive in New England. Squanto was able to do this and communicate with the pilgrims because he had learned English from previous groups that came to the towns of the United States or future United States. He was a Native American and became a guide to the Plymouth settlers and European during their first winter in the New World. He was born near Plymouth, Massachusetts. Little is known about his early life. In 1614, he was kidnapped. Now, this is before the Mayflower now. He was kidnapped by English explorers who brought him to Spain, where he was sold into slavery. Squanto escaped and was eventually returned to North America in 1619. He then returned to the Pauxet region, where he became an interpreter and guide for the Pilgrim settlers at Plymouth Colony in 1620. This may be a mystery, but as I read it, you might think of it. The first officially recorded biracial marriage in what later became the United States of America. This was between John Rolfe Colonist and Pocahontas. The marriage was not between a Caucasian and an African American. You might think so because of the first biracial marriage, but Pocahontas was an American Indian or Native American. The history of Pocahontas was greatly exaggerated by Walt Disney, but she was a real person who lived and bore a child, but we don't know too much about her except from this Walt Disney and the taunts during the 1916 presidential election. Here's what happened. Pocahontas, though completely honorable, became a negative taunt and slur during the 1916 presidential election and continues into this present year. And I'm sure now that you hear that name, you will remember what was going on during the 1916 election. Likely the first official legally recorded biracial marriage, it was later in what later became the United States of America. Pocahontas had one child, Thomas Rolfe, who had many descendants. Her sister, as I mentioned, was greatly exaggerated by Walt Disney, but he did not ridicule her. The name, this is where you will remember, you meaning all of you residents, the name Pocahontas became a negative taunt and slur during the 1916 presidential election campaign, and this continues to the present year. In fact, I heard it mentioned 2 weeks ago. One candidate, Elizabeth Warren, claimed that she had American Indian blood. She had her DNA tested, and the results showed some American Indian heritage. And she mentioned that, probably bragging for political purposes. Candidate Donald Trump picked up on that and frequently made fun of her and called her Pocahontas. From then on, Pocahontas might be a household name, but the true story of her short but powerful life has been buried in myths over since the 17th century. To start with, Pocahontas wasn't even her real name. Born about 1596, her real name was Amonute, and she also had the more private name of Matoaka. After marriage, she changed her name to Rebecca Rolfe. John and Pocahontas had a child, and they lived in London for a time, and the Rolfes boarded a ship to return to Virginia. So Pocahontas and John lived in London for some time. The ship had only gone as far as Gravesend when Pocahontas fell ill. She was taken ashore where she died possibly of pneumonia or tuberculosis. After traveling down the Thames River, Pocahontas, seriously ill, had to be taken ashore. In the town of Gravesend, Pocahontas died of an unspecified illness. Many historians believe she suffered from an upper respiratory ailment such as pneumonia, while others think she could have died from some form of dysentery. Their son, Thomas Rolfe, was a child of an Englishman and a Native American woman. Some aspects of his life were particularly controversial. He expressed interest during his lifetime in rekindling relations with his Native American relatives, despite societal ridicule and laws which forbade such contact. There later were some historical accounts of conflicts between the descendants of John Rolfe and Pocahontas and the descendants of John Rolfe and his second wife, a Caucasian. At some points, the two began meeting together. Later, they had controversy and met separately, but then they decided that we'll just meet together. Sometimes DNA results will now show a small amount of American Indian heritage among Americans thought to be completely Caucasian, including one of my sons-in-law. I asked one of the RAs, an African-American RA this morning, telling her about this, and she said that she also has Native American blood in her heritage. This is also the case of some DNA results showing a small amount of Polynesian heritage in some of us. Think about how that might have happened. It's easy to think about the Native Americans and Caucasians being married or mated, but what about these Polynesians? How did they get into American heritage and our DNA? Sometime I'll tell you about what my guess is on that. Finally, as you remember, do you remember two American patriots, both former presidents who were sometimes close friends and sometimes political opponents, but who died on the same day in 1826? These were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both presidents. Both died on the same day, not only the same date, but actually the same date. That was an amazing coincidence and political unusual dates, but to make matters even more historical, their death was on the 4th of July, Independence Day. Someone writing a script for that would have been ridiculed, saying, no, that couldn't have happened. That's too much of a coincidence, but it did. And they didn't know that they were both dying on the same day, but that's what happened. Independence Day in 1826, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the 4th of July. So finally, if there are any of your brain cells awake today, and you would have won thousands of dollars on TV quiz shows by recognizing these names' events. Do you remember any of them? Or, as I mentioned before, when you heard them, you thought to yourself, oh yes, I remember that. Keep thinking about new ideas instead of being bored. It might make your day go better. For next week, try and remember real stories about your grandparents and past and present family members and how they survived during their lives during depressions, wars, and happy and satisfying times. And we will continue with those events for next week, but think about stories are most important What happened? How did they live through the Depression? What was happening during while the men were in the wars? Things like that. Think about these, and they might give you some information to think about over the week and next week. Thank you.